Today we have another Hometown Historian channel production. Enjoy. So I'm making a quick video here. I try to always get the information correct in my videos, and yesterday I released a video on haunted history and the lost love of Ann Coleman, the tragic tale of lost love. And with this particular tale, it wasn't so much about the history, it was more about the ghost story at what was the Inn 422. It's now, like I said, it's a Masago restaurant or something like that. It's like a Japanese cuisine type thing. But I had a couple things wrong. Now, the reason I had them wrong is I took them from a book called Ghosts of Hershey and Vicinity by Christopher E. Wolfe. And I just have a whole story that's on this, and they say specifically that after her graduation from Dickinson College in Carlisle, Coleman's had a large, prosperous family, 9 sons and 5 daughters, hardworking, sharp-witted, and very wealthy. In fact, they were one of the wealthiest families in the nation turn of the 18th century, all of which that is true except for the Dickinson College thing. Ann Coleman, after her graduation, returned to Lebanon and started her law practice on the current site of the Lebanon County Historical Society. So, first, and then they talk about later on that, after her death, why would she be a ghost in this house? Because she spent her happiest time of her life. Well, first off, I don't know the exact date. I haven't been able to find the exact date of when the house was actually built, because she actually graduated in, I believe, 1819, if that's what would have been. So if this was a gift, I think it was just a gift in general. That's what the Colemans did. They were very wealthy. And it says in the first paragraph, it talks about that the first half of the original house is the foundation, which I took to mean the first part of the house was still original, which apparently none of it was original, and it probably was raised shortly after her death. I would suspect. It may not be, I really don't know. But anyways, the house she never resided in, that they built for her for whatever reason. It wasn't for a graduation from Dickinson College. I sort of thought when I read that it seemed odd, and I didn't remember reading anything about her graduating from Dickinson College, because at 23, and especially with a law degree, that was not common for back then at all. And in fact, the first female lawyer in America, as Mule Skinner put up, was in 1869. I believe it was an Arabelle. I'll have to get the name. Maybe we'll do a Women of History, Heroines of Hometown History, because she was the first American lawyer. And then the first actual female graduate of Dickinson College was 1887. So I don't know where this guy got his information from, or if he just made it up, or if he read something, because it is, unfortunately, when you do these things, you get your information from where you can get it, and you assume that it's correct. And reading that somebody took the time to make a book of these ghost stories, you would assume that the information that he had in there was correct. Obviously not. Now, some of the information I had read quite a few places. There were several different circumstances of ending of their engagement. Now, what I've read as of late with some of these other stories, I read somebody's dissertation on it, which they did it when they were in high school, so even then, it's just one of those things that you hope that the history that is quote-unquote preserved is actual history, because I've said several times before, it's sometimes you get something and you're hoping it's correct, and it turns out it's not, which stinks. So I apologize for that, but it sounds like from what I've read, which seems even more feasible, Robert Coleman was a really hard man, but he wasn't a terribly unjust man, and he had some reasons to be slightly concerned about James Buchanan. I guess in the 1816 election, he had bet a property on what the result would be and lost that to, because there were 4 big families in Lancaster City, which had been the capital of Pennsylvania. It's also where, Philadelphia as well was where the wealthy families, and they sort of intermarried because there was sort of that stipulation that you had to marry into your society, and James Buchanan was much lower than the society. He was working his way towards that, but they also, the Colemans and the Buchanans had been, when Robert Coleman was a young child, he had been born in Ireland. They had been neighbors, and I guess they were somewhat disreputable. And nobody really knows the reason why Robert Coleman had so much animosity towards James Buchanan in general. It seems like he made it difficult for whoever the suitors of his daughters were. He made it difficult unless they really matched up well society-wise. Now, the reasoning, which this sort of embarks in some of these other theories of what broke it up, I guess she had a bunch of people, including her family, in her ear and saying that James Buchanan was only interested in her because of the family's riches, which, as we'll explain here later, was certainly not the case. Like, he actually loved her. And Buchanan really was not that interested in that. He was very much about, which when she sent this letter, it slighted him really hard and made it almost impossible. Like, he was very much about reputation and about character. So when she finally, I guess it was in 1819, there was a panic, and a lot of people that were invested in property, it became a very hard time for them. So he was in the middle of a lawsuit for the Columbia Bridge Company, and they were about to lose their right to make any more bridges. So he wasn't spending a whole lot of time with her at the time, and apparently that upset her. And then everybody being in her ear that he was only interested in her because of the money sort of got to her. So she sent him a letter accusing him of this, and that slight to his character and his reputation was something that he couldn't really forgive in a way. And his way of dealing with things, which sort of followed him through the rest of his life, was if there was an issue, like with the coming Civil War when he was president, is you sort of were like, okay, it'll work itself out, sort of thing. And that was probably not the right approach in that regard. So it upset her even further, and her father and her family sort of pushed that as well. So she went down to Philadelphia to see her sister, who was married to Judge, I think, Hemphill. And there was also, I guess, several plays that were going on in Philadelphia at the time. And they did something back then in the 1800s that if a woman was stressed or something like that, they called it female hysteria. So it was common practice, they would prescribe laudanum. And if laudanum was taken in too high of a dosage because of the opium, it would in essence make you fall asleep and you die in your sleep. It wasn't a painful death, but that was a way a lot of people back then, if they wanted to commit suicide, that's how they did it. So there's never officially that she definitely committed suicide, but it was sort of, I think, assumed because of all the things that were going on at the time. So it might have been just a mistaken overdose, but nobody really, we'll never know. It's just one of those things that happens with history, especially with the amount of time. Now, on James Buchanan's side, he was completely broken by this when he found out about her death, and he pleaded with the Colemans to allow him to walk beside the casket to be allowed to the funeral, and they just sent the letter back because they blamed him, even though that in actuality the Colemans were probably more at blame. If it was a suicide, they were probably much more at blame than James Buchanan for whatever happened to her, because they were obstinate. He wasn't good enough, and he's a decent man. He had his issues just like anybody else, but he had a set of letters from Anne in their romance when they became engaged, and he kept them wrapped with a pink ribbon. And he had, at the time of his death, at his request, that they would be burned. Now, the folder that was over top of them, that was kept with his original note, because he actually took care of his nieces and nephews. Their parents had died, and he actually took care of them like if he was basically their uncle father. And he raised them, he got them their education, and he made sure that they had money to go into life, to be able to start their life. So he was a good guy, because his niece was actually, like, they called, like, instead of the first lady, the person that sort of took care of all the important functions of the White House, with having a first lady, because he was a bachelor president. He actually had his niece there to take care of that, and that explains the relationship, because she was basically like his daughter. But they did what he asked. They burnt the letters and stuff like that, so nobody knows what was in them. But from what correspondence that does exist between him and Ann Coleman, some of those letters exist of her accusing him of that kind of stuff, and just it was sad. It was too many cooks in the kitchen where you had people involved. It was part of the societal influences. It was doomed from the get-go. It was just one of those relationships that didn't stand a chance, and it's a shame. But that's the information, the more that I've gotten with this. It's a few of the corrections. And like I said, I always try to get the information as correct as possible. But like I said, you assume in a book, and this is more ghost stories. I did find one other story in there that was wrong person, wrong place, wrong time type of thing as well. But you assume in this case, it was just two different small tidbits that were completely, well, three different tidbits that were completely incorrect. She never was a lawyer. She never graduated from Dickinson. And apparently the house was razed, which made sense when it was razed. Who knows? But the house that's there now was built, I guess, like 1880. But that was also used as sort of like the superintendent's mansion for the Colebrook furnace. So the Colemans continued to own what was on site there. It's just a matter of when the house was taken down. But apparently, from the ghost story, whatever you want to believe in that regard, they say this ghost, they believe it's the ghost of Ann Coleman that's going around in there. But it doesn't make sense, like the room 202 being her favorite room, or being a former bedroom or something like that, because she never lived in the house. But that's the story. I'm sticking to it. I've read a couple little sources to try to clarify these things and just make sure that whatever was not correct is, I get it as correct as possible. But as always, I want to thank you guys for coming along. Just wanted to do this little video. I'll release this one and then release another one later today, just as getting things correct with that story. So thanks everybody as always for coming along, and we'll see you all about town.